become our Prime Minister. Remember, please, he will count you in.
Okay, my name is Angelo. I'll be the Prime Minister for this debate. I'll be taking POIs specifically from the closing opposition, just so that we can have some sort of engagement, right? We could have, does anyone have a time I can borrow? All right, cool, I'll just go in. 3, 2, 1. This House believes globalization has failed. Panel, from opening government, we think that characterization of what globalization was supposed to actually look like is important in this debate, right? We think that the idea of the ideal world looks like a global village, right? We think that that is the goal that globalization sort of was seeking to attain, right? So we look at things like, for example, increased mobility across borders with ease, right? We look at things like cooperation in trade, cooperation in actually solving global problems like climate change, cooperation in solving global problems like security, like hunger, collectively, right? We think that that particular aspect is actually important in this debate. If we're looking at collective development, we'll show you to the extent that where this has actually not been achieved, we have to actually believe that globalization has failed. But most importantly, we look at globalization actually seeking to attain a consistent and cross-cutting foreign policies that look to adopt an outward position or position of collective development as opposed to a position of isolation, right? We look at things like globalization as an answer to isolationist policies, right? In a world where we show you that these isolationist policies have actually increased as opposed to reduced, we think that that is a direct counter to what the concept of globalization means and what it seeks to achieve, right? So we think that this debate requires a retrospective analysis of what globalization actually means, right? We think that has failed requires us to look back in the past and actually examine whether we actually have a basis to conclude that indeed it has failed. So we do not expect any of the opposition teams to actually talk about future harms or some sort of futuristic interest, right? We think that that is also an important characterization in this debate. So what will you get from the opening government? From opening government, we'll show you why an analysis of all the stakeholders and the global actors within this particular world has adopted or chosen themselves over the global good or cooperation, right? We think to that extent they've actually failed globalization. So first point of analysis is globalization and commitment within the developed world, right? We think that from the 1990s to 2008, right, we look at, for example, China adopting a more liberal trade policy with the West, right? We think that that is actually more consistent with the goal of globalization. But we think that if you look at it after the 2008 financial crisis, we actually look at a more drastic shift to policies that actually seek to protect individual countries as opposed to the collective good. We think that this has manifested in concepts like, for example, Make America Great Again, that seeks to actually clamp down on extent or outward movement of American policies, of American aid, and things like this, right? We think that this also looks like, for example, Brexit, which looks like an outward movement of the British an outward movement of England out of a system that was previously meant to make trade easier within Europe and, for example, harmonize policies, trade policies, and monetary policies, right? We feel that this represents, one, an aversion to the collective good as opposed to in favor of themselves, right? In favor of an isolationist policy, right? We also think that also the use of, for example, coercion by more powerful players within the global scale actually represents, one, a disrespect for sovereignty, and two, the need or use of coercion to actually achieve objectives, right? We think that the use of coercion is directly counter to, for example, a global world that seeks to adopt a collective development. Because we think that if you're using coercion to actually gain your interests, we think that that is directly harming another person that is supposed to, another global actor that is supposed to actually be a player within that particular debate, which brings us very nicely to our second point of argumentation, which is what globalization actually looks like within the developing world, and why that analysis is actually particularly important, because we think that the developing world is actually the people that have got the shortest end of the stick. And we think that where globalization actually seeks to adopt some point of collective movement towards some goals, we think that where you leave continents like Africa, an entire continent behind, we think that that is actually directly counter or directly against the whole concept of globalization, right? We think that that makes it more of lip service as opposed to actually taking action to achieve these goals. I'll take POIs if there are any. Okay, globalization within the developing world. We think that globalization was advertised to Africa specifically as a mechanism that would aid the globalized world to develop some sort of economic development, right? We think that secondly, it was also advertised as a system that was meant to give some sort of reparations for historical harms like slavery and colonialism, right? We think that this looks like things like increase in aid, or maybe increase in education, or maybe reducing mobility across these borders and stratospheres, right? We think that we're at the point where you look at more strict immigration policies within Europe and within America. We think that that actually represents a counter to this particular narrative. But secondly, we think that an analysis of past events like COVID-19, like the COVID-19 pandemic, where one, the African continent specifically and the developing world was in need of help. Two, for example, we look at things like vaccines or refusal to actually share patent rights within this, within the developing world, right? Within the developing world, and instead hoarding these particular vaccines, hoarding this particular technology. We think that that is directly counter to what globalization actually seeks to achieve. We think that where it was advertised as, oh, we are all trying to move towards this collective benefit, we think that in a space where one, you recognize that help is needed, and two, you recognize that you do not actually make any significant loss from that help, but three, we think that globalization actually best exists in a world where other countries are willing to take short-term harms in order to achieve the collective good, right? In our case, we show you exactly why these countries have shown, one, a very little willingness to actually take these small concessions in order to achieve the larger collective, right? We think that this looks like, for example, Africa being left behind in the move for globalization, right? We think that at an extent where you leave even one actor behind, we think that that is targeted, and we think that that is actually directly counter to globalization, to what globalization means. But in our extension, the DPM will show you why actually this trickles down, not just from a continental or global actors level, right? Because we've shown you the developed world and also the developing world, and why this is important. But we'll show you why that even at a social level, there has actually been a disparity that has only grown with time, right? We think that to that extent, globalization cannot be considered to be a success. Panel, what do you get from opening government? Opening government gives you a characterization of what globalization sought to achieve or what it was meant to look like. But secondly, we show you that there's been a consistent adoption of an isolationist policy that is directly counter to what globalization means. But thirdly, we tell you that even within the developed world, there's still not been a net benefit. But thirdly, even within the developing world, we think that where they've been left behind and their interests have been taken as secondary, we believe that globalization has failed.
Thank you, the Prime Minister. We now welcome the opposition side. Leader of opposition, the floor is yours.
Sorry, just starting my timer. Okay, beginning my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, panel, at what point has something failed? We're telling you as opening opposition that something has failed when it has failed to produce its intended purpose. Number two, we are telling you that something has failed when the alternative is much more better than what we are talking about, and that is where this debate is supposed to be. Now, moving on to some few rebuttals from what little we had from the Prime Minister. Now, he comes here, ladies and gentlemen, and gives us this idea about how globalization led to the 2008 financial crisis. Now, the logical issue which we find with that status, ladies and gentlemen, is legitimacy. Because we're telling you the 2008 global crisis, ladies and gentlemen, was found by the virtue of the isolated economic policies of a particular single country, here being America, ladies and gentlemen. We're telling you, ladies and gentlemen, that it was neglecting the world market, ladies and gentlemen, and making its own policies, and that is where we found globalization helps in terms of that, ladies and gentlemen. We're telling you, ladies and gentlemen, it was through globalization that we're able, ladies and gentlemen, to move out of that financial crisis and be back to a great economic market. Therefore, the entire issue of what they're talking about doesn't stand in today's debate. Now, it also comes here, ladies and gentlemen, and give us this idea about how Africa is left behind. I found this funny, ladies and gentlemen, because now imagine an Africa which cannot trade with its resources, ladies and gentlemen. Imagine the oil of Nigeria being left useless, ladies and gentlemen, because they cannot trade with other international countries which you rely on this oil, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, which now world leaves Africa behind, ladies and gentlemen? A world where by now they cannot imply globalization in order to uplift the people of Africa, or a world where just everyone is just left as an island on its own and cannot participate in the economical trade in the entire world. That is what this debate is about. We also come here and he gives us this funny idea about how globalization doesn't solve the climate change which is happening here. But you need to understand, when you're dealing with the question of climate change, you need a collective effort in order to address it. What does it mean? It means, okay, different trade relations from different countries and their different industries coming together and talking and say, okay, this is what we need to do in order to address that issue. That is what status quo is doing. Therefore, if it was current to the world, the harms would be much higher. That is what the debate is about. Now, let's do some reconciliation of what actually globalization looks like. We are telling you that globalization is actually a term which describes the trade and technology which has made the world a more connected than interdependent place. That is what the debate is. We are telling you that this is important because it highlights the spread of flow of financial products, goods, and technology, and information and jobs across national borders and cultures, and that is something which we value in today's debate. Now, the government, the open government, as an entire bench, has to come here, and prove to us how globalization, has inherently failed. They have to come here, and tell us now how it has failed in being able to achieve a more connected and integrated world. We are telling you that a status quo, it hasn't failed because the world is more integrated than it was 1,000 years ago. Telling you it is a gradual process, and globalization is the best mechanism in connecting the world. That is what we're here to argue for. We're here to argue for a better trade relations between countries. Now, what more? What more are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about the issue of an integrated trade system. What do we mean? We need to understand that what is existing in status quo, there is an integrated trade system, something which we value. We are telling you, look at the COVID pandemic, which they also talked to about. Now, imagine how the world stopped when we couldn't get the goods from the China. How many businesses suffered because they couldn't buy the services from Japan, they couldn't buy technologies from Egypt and all of that stuff. That is the virtue of what globalization is, and the world of COVID actually highlighted how it is dangerous for us to not have a globalization, because the world remain islands, the businesses suffer, and the economies of many different countries, they fail. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand that no nation exists as an island. We all need to be able to help each other as different nations. We're telling you, this looks like South Africa giving vaccines in terms of trade and selling vaccines to Zimbabwe, because that is a trade relation which they have, and that is something which we value into this debate, and that is why we're saying, okay, globalization is actually quite useful. We're also telling you, ladies and gentlemen, that globalization reduces the cost of manufacturing, which is something that we value. Now, we're telling you that this looks like us buying certain parts of some machinery parts or some technology parts from Kenya, and buying some parts from Zimbabwe, and buying some parts from Uganda, and that is something which we value because it helps us integrate and create many things which will help uplift Africa at a lower cost of manufacturing. And that's something which we value, and it helps Africa. It doesn't leave them behind as an integrated response to what they're talking about. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand also that different regions have different resources. Why is this helpful? Because there are things which we will need, which just grows. For example, in Rwanda, there are just things which just grow. For example, in Kenya, this is very important because now it helps now those particular countries be able to export, what resources they have, in order to help globalize and also help the economy, and most importantly, the people living there in the ground get better economical opportunities. They're able to sell their plants to other countries. They're able to do all that stuff. Now, moving forward, you need to understand that before even moving forward, I will take you.
Do you think Africa has really benefited from the globalization movement?
Yes, because now we're actually we're actually approaching the third industrial revolution, which is something which can never be done without globalization. We're telling you, ladies and gentlemen, it is because of Africa's relationship with other global countries that has helped us improve us. And also, this looks like the BRICS, whereby South Africa is part of an economical trade with your Russia, with your Brazil. This is the connecting nerves, and also what value we find from this thing, literally. Another thing that we need to understand that globalization has increased better international relations between countries. What does this mean? We mean that there are relationships which are brought by countries being able to trade with each other. They actually espouse the economical divide which exists within those countries. Yes, we know that there are still economical divides which exist, but the harm without globalization would be a way bigger economical divide. Another thing that we need to talk about is the issue of the advancement of technology, especially in developing countries. Because we see that through this trade of technology, we're able now to advance our infrastructure. We're able to get a better technology and also make us more connected, and that is what this globalization is all about, connecting each and everyone. We're also saying that through globalization, there's also the issue of information which is being shared, which is something which we value. This looks like the world talking to each other about how is it that they can, they're able to solve issues such as the health issues, such as how to fight the pandemic of Ebola, the pandemic of COVID, because it is only made possible through sharing of information. That is what is brought by globalization. We're also telling you that that also helps in terms of security of the particular country, because you say, okay, if there is a terrorist organization which is happening there, the security companies of the country can be able to share those resources with the other country, and therefore help increasing the security which exists. This is something which we find to be very valuable in today's debate, because we're telling you that the world needs to be connected. Nobody exists as an island, and the globalization has actually helped us, bring us much further, and also has uplifted Africa, has uplifted many developing nations, because they need, they are given an opportunity to be able to participate now into the global trade. Because I'm telling you, we always show you the harm of a world whereby there is no globalization. We're telling you the harm of an entire single country making its own decision about how America did in the 2008 global pandemic, about how it was in the COVID pandemic, whereby now we couldn't communicate with each other. Ladies and gentlemen, I've never been more proud to oppose any motion. I thank the House at large.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. We'd love to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. The floor is here.
Panel, to rank first in today's debate, the government bench has to prove specifically two things. One, we have to demonstrate that globalization as a concept has failed, something exclusively get from Angelo. But secondly, we have to also demonstrate to you that the failure of globalization as a concept has led to a failure to achieve what the objectives of that particular concept actually were. What do we get from the opening opposition team by of feeble rebuttal and feeble engagements, right? First is the idea that globalization was only meant to deal with trade and technology. From side opening of government, we tell you globalization is a bigger concept that goes beyond merely trade and technology, right? We think it extends to things like finding ways to resolve global problems like diseases, global problems like war, among other things, right? We think globalization enshrines or envisions a world where people can come together, and instead of resorting to war like China and like Russia and Ukraine, we find an amicable way of resolving what our particular conflicts might be. We think, Pano, a globalized world is one where, instead of resorting to things like economic sanctions, we sit down on a table with two fighting parties and we find an amicable way of resolving what our particular differences might be. We think the framing we get from the leader of opposition puts them out of this discussion, right? But then secondly, the idea of that the 2008 economic crisis was caused by the US isolationist policy, we think that is a gross mischaracterization of what actually happened, right? We think, the reason why that crisis did not affect only the US but spread to the entire world was precisely because there was a harmonization of international banking standards. That is why when the housing bubble in the US exploded, everyone in the US, in Europe, and in most of Africa was affected by this because we lived in a globalized world which had been attained through a gradual process of increasing trade among the states from the end of the from the collapse of the Soviet Union until 2008. What Angela specifically tells you by of characterization of what the world actually looked like was this, right? That after World War II, there was a need for states to come together and adopt common policies to addressing some of the common problems we have, right? The height of the globalization was actually attained after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was increased trade among the states, right? We think after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economy of that particular state was able to grow from a few $100 billion to what it was at 2.8 of about 1.5 trillion US dollars, because there was increased trade between previous enemies like Russia and the USA and like the global West, right? That means that economy was able to develop. But secondly, we tell you the reason why China was able to become an economic powerhouse was because we all considered to the fact that they had the people, and therefore there was massive investment there, which made China the manufacturers of the world. This meant that there was an interchange of resources among the states, which is what the world actually looked like. And there was a gradual move towards us achieving a situation where we are constantly cooperating with each other to achieve the benefit, like to achieve what was within the common interests of everyone. What did the world look like after 2008? Isolationist policies began cropping up, like Brexit in the UK, like Make America Great Again under Donald Trump, and things like that. We think, these are fundamental policies which have pushed back against the concept of globalization and have stopped us from achieving a unified world or unified policy in which we strive to achieve things which benefit everyone, right? What do we tell you, or what specific examples demonstrate the failure of globalization in the present world? The first thing Angelo tells you is the use of coercion and force in the present world. Let me mechanize that and show you what it looks like in the present world, right? We think right now, it looks like instead of Russia and Ukraine talking like they always have to resolve their conflicts, it looks like Russia invading people of Ukraine to get what they want, right? It looks like Russia like amassing more than 500,000 forces at the borders of Ukraine right now as we speak, getting ready for a second invasion to forcefully get what they want. The burden of the opposition bench is to show us why, in a world where we are choosing to use force, instead of coming together to talk to resolve our conflicts, why that resembles a globalized world within which we are trying to attain common benefits for everyone. What we tell you from side opening government is that the need to use force means that there is a failure of talks, which was part of the things, which was part of the goals that were envisioned in a globalized world, like we tell you from side opening government. Secondly, we tell you the use of economic sanctions by states like the US and the global West, right? We tell you states like the US and like the EU member states have always used sanctions to attain what their goals are. These are soft means of coercing states which do not agree with you to do what you actually want, right? Sanctions on states like Iran, instead of trying to find ways of resolving them by talking peacefully to overcome what our differences actually are. From side opening government, we tell you, in a world where you need to impose sanctions, instead of talking to your enemy to try and find a common ground through which you can resolve your different understandings, we think to that extent globalization has failed because it is a mechanism for us to come together and resolve our conflicts. But thirdly, again on this, is the idea of emerging different blocks which are standing in the way of attaining global unity, right? We tell you the existence of blocks like BRICS, which is specifically formed to counter what we presently have in the global West, but not the main purpose of BRICS existing is so that they can counter like US dominance, right? Not exactly to cooperate with the US. So it is a block essentially formed to oppose another, right? But then secondly, we tell you the existence of something like the Shanghai Economic Cooperation also was formed to again counter the West. We think this is a world which is consistently being divided along Eastern and Western lines. We think to that extent that cannot be a world within which we think that globalization is A, being achieved, or two, that the objectives are being achieved. We think a globalized world looks like one where we are all coming together and we have one economic block within which we are all trading, but not multiple different blocks which are counter to each other, which are opposing each other, which are all trying to overthrow each other and not achieve what the objectives of everyone within the confines of the globalized world actually are. Lastly, the contextualization of what Africa actually looks like within the present world. Right now, the Prime Minister tells you that Africa has actually been able to benefit from globalization because we are improving. One, we tell you the rate of development in Africa has been much lower because most of the partner states which come to invest in Africa do not come to invest because they essentially have an interest in the state. They come here because they want to exploit Africa for what Africa actually has to provide. We think that is why states like Kenya are presently having big debts with China, right? Things like the recent rail construction was an opportunistic way of the Chinese government getting a deep say within what this particular state should do. We think to the extent that most of the states which come here not because they want Africa to benefit, but because they have incentives which they can best achieve by exploiting the African people, by exploiting the African government. That does not represent a world within which the interests of every state are taken into account while considering policies, but within which B, everyone has a say in what should be done for the common good of everyone within the confines of a globalized world. Lastly, we tell you the idea of international relations, right? What the Prime Minister tells you is that their world, one where we have international relations, is a world where there's globalization. From side opening government, we tell you, One, those international relations are largely falling apart because the best example again is what is happening in Russia and the threat by China to invade Taiwan. That shows that there is a fundamental disconnect between the discussions on what we need to resolve the problems we have. But secondly, we tell you, in a globalized world, it's not necessarily about having increased international relations. It's about having increased relations within which the interests of each and everyone are actually respected and listened to. To the extent that Africa is not being listened to but exploited, to the extent that when we need help, we cannot get it from the people who are supposed to give it to us, we tell you that that does not represent what the interests or what the concept of a globalized world is supposed to be. To that extent, we demand the government, the opposition, to demonstrate to us a couple of things: that A, it has achieved its objectives, but two, that is actually a concept which is thriving. What we have been able to demonstrate to you is that A, it is not working, it has failed, and it will never work given the present circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I'd love to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to wrap up the opening half. Here.
Just give me a second, my timer. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We don't think it's our burden to prove to you that states inherently shouldn't care about their sovereignty. We don't think it's our burden to prove to you that we only achieve globalization when states have like an open border policy and are willing to engage with every single state, although we don't think that's the debate. The debate here is specifically about where we are right now in terms of globalization and whether or not that's been beneficial to us as like in individual countries and most specifically the individuals on the ground, right? That's the impact that we need to talk about, and that's the impact that's important in today's debate. 2 points of responses I want to talk about before I go into like clashes and then into my argumentation. Number one, a large portion of the DLO speech, he comes and he talks to you about sanctions, right? He tells you about how sanctions shouldn't be the mechanism that we use to hold individuals accountable and persuade countries to make economic acts. 2 issues with this. Number one, we wouldn't even been able to use sanctions in the first place if we didn't have global trade relations. If Russia wasn't trading with anyone, we wouldn't be able to sanction them, right? Here's the thing, right? We tell you that inherently, when you have 193 different states, or you have like all these different countries interacting with one another, one of them is going to act out. One of them is going to make a decision that harms other individuals, right? That's going to happen regardless on either side of the house. What happens on the other side of the house is because our economies are so integrated and because we're able to like provide goods and services, and not just that, in terms of like relations with each other, we're able to better hold people accountable. Like, look at a world where if Russia had no trade relations with anyone else and no one else was dependent on Russia, it would be significantly harder to hold them accountable for what they were doing, right? But moreover, we tell you that when these individuals actively make decisions that hurt other countries or harm other individuals, we think that's why like we have these mechanisms in place anyways, right? This is the reason why after like the world wars, we've decided to create structures such as the UN, and we've decided to create regional structures that create this discourse and dialogue. It exists because we understand the need for cooperation and we understand the need for individuals to work together. I'll take you at 5 minutes, right? We think majority of the case, they spend telling you about like why it's going to fail, right? We think 2 responses here, and just like on their criteria, they tell us that they need to prove that globalization as a concept has failed, and number 2, like it has failed, when it has failed to achieve its objectives, why it's being significantly harmful. I'm going to show you on both those points why they lose. Number 1, we think at the point at which we can show you that trade is inherently better, and that even countries that were significantly disadvantaged without the globalization are significantly better, especially for the individuals on the ground. We think we're much better. How does this look like? We think when you have a globalized economy and you have like a system that we have today where it's very easy to transport goods and services between different countries, and we do have these trade relations existing, what then happens, it means the cost of manufacturing is significantly reduced, right? It means that we're able to get goods at a much cheaper rate. It means that, like, for example, if I wanted to get a car, instead of me building a factory and then building that car, I could import that car, right? What does that mean for the consumer on the ground? It means, one, that those consumers are able to get things at a much cheaper rate, which
which then increases the standard of living, right? So I think that's the mechanism that we need to use to evaluate like whether or not globalization has failed. We think that when you don't have these trade relations, you kind of forced to then like make your own plan, right? And they spoke about COVID as well. I just want to use this as an example here for a second. During the COVID pandemic, when we had the lockdown, we had a very good analyzation of what it looked like without like globalization, without these trade and like these negotiations actually working out, right? We think that like certain countries were just not able to access medical equipment such as like basic PPE, such as masks. Why was that the case? That was the case because they were dependent on other countries to provide it to them, and the minute those trade routes cut off, it became significantly more expensive to get those things. What does it mean? It meant like you were paying like almost $2 for a mask that was normally like 30 cents. Why is that the case? That's the case because it is significantly cheaper to operate in a globalized economy, right? Two impacts of this. Number one, the individual on the ground is significantly better for this because we protect that individual by ensuring that they have a better quality of life. Number two, we allow states to interact with each other based on what they do best. So, like, it doesn't make sense for you to start and like open a million other factories to produce every single thing you need when there's a country like next door to you or like just across the ocean that can provide that same thing for you. We think that's like very important to characterize in this debate. Number two, like just on the COVID response again, they tell us that like certain countries inherently wouldn't provide vaccines and like just chose to be bad actors. We think that it's not our obligation in this debate to prove to you that everyone's going to be an actor. Everyone's going to be a bad actor or good actor for that regard. We don't think that like in a state where everyone's going to actively interact with that. We think they are going to be individuals who choose to like pursue their own interests, and we don't think that like significantly harms the impacts of globalization, right? So even at the point at which Russia decides to invade Ukraine, and we have to isolate Russia specifically, because of how integrated every other economy is, it doesn't impact the way we do trade that much, right? So we can then go and find our oil resources somewhere else. We're then able to engage with another country. We're then able to still make sure that at the end of the day, we have fuel to fund our enterprises. Thank you quickly.
Now, you realize that the imposition of economic sanctions is what is forcing countries to find their own ways of existing independently without trying to go as much trade with like the global West and other entities as possible.
Sure, so here's the
thing. Russia is moving away, Iran is moving away, and China is leaving there.
Sure, here's the thing, but under their mechanism, those sanctions can't even work at whole. So at the point at which under their mechanism, Russia has no international ties and no one has trade agreements with Russia, we can't even use sanctions as a mechanism to hold them accountable. This course is not valuable. We don't think that sitting down at a table between these states has ever achieved anything. We think the nature of states is that they do what's best for their state. As South Africa, I'm going to do what's best for my country and invest in what's best for my country, right? And that's inherently not problematic. We don't think it's a problem for states to choose themselves and to prioritize themselves. But it works in a globalized world because if I'm prioritizing myself and you prioritizing yourself, and together, if we're able to get a net benefit from each other, we're going to work together and we're going to want to implement trade. That's the reason why like countries are investing so much in Africa. They're investing in Africa because they see a benefit in that. They see that, you know what, there is a return for investment because of this. We don't think that this is harmful. We think that that benefit, it can be like monopolized in a globalized economy. Whereas if it wasn't globalized, we wouldn't get those investments. We wouldn't get like those impacts that we're able to show you for the people on the ground. Moreover, our analysis here is twofold. Number one, we don't think you can say a system has failed when it has achieved a net benefit for the individuals on the ground. When you think we're able to achieve a better quality of life and better like security for those individuals. Number two, when we're better able to hold states accountable through mechanisms such as sanctions, which they hate so much, and through mechanisms such as like relations and knowing that you need something from me, therefore we have to have a relationship because it's a mutually beneficial relationship. We think we're better at holding states accountable. We think we're better for the individuals. We think we win today's debate.
Thank you, the Deputy Leader of Opposition. We're now done with the opening half. I'd love to welcome our Member of Government to start us off in the closing half. Here.
So I'll take my POIs around my 5th minute. So if you have any POI, just wait around that time. You can raise your hand and I'll take you when I'm ready. All right. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. Notice that the opening half of the debate has largely been about, well, the advantages and disadvantages of what globalization has done. But we think that shouldn't really be how the debate should go. We think that for any side to win, there has to be a metric to measure the intent of globalization as against its consequences. So we from CG are going to give you a metric whereby we are going to measure how we think the intent of globalization was formed and how the status quo looks like, and whether it has failed to achieve all those intents or whether it has failed. Before that, pieces of framing. What necessitated the globalization agenda or narrative? First, we think that those who started the whole idea of globalization were the world rich, the powerful countries, US and all those things. We think they did that because they wanted to have access to bigger markets to be able to trade their goods, because they knew that the only way they could remain powerful is to control the world. By doing that, they controlled the world market and how trade was able to go. That is why you find China and US always competing and fighting. We think that this whole idea of globalization was an idea of the rich, the more powerful country. Second piece of framing, we think that the whole idea of globalization was to make these powerful countries to use the platform to be able to advance or use their culture to be able to influence or infiltrate other cultures so that they can have that dominance and relevance on the world stage. Third pieces of framing, we think that the whole idea of globalization, important panel, was global peace. And this is going to be very important in today's debate. Panel, I already told you there has to be a metric by which you can access today's debate and define what the consequences look like and whether it has failed. First piece of metric, we think that for us to analyze whether globalization has failed, no matter how good things it has brought, we think there has to be the analysis of whether it has brought an irreparable harm to the world. Second metric should be whether it has brought more inequalities, and thirdly, whether there's a slippery slope that is currently happening. First piece of argument, panel, in the process of globalizing, it means that more powerful countries saw this as an opportunity to rise to the top. That is why you find US and co. in the wake-up of the third industrial and fourth industrial revolution building up more factories because they wanted to produce more goods to be able to supply the global market. China also did the same. And what was the consequences of this? You saw that it led to increased temperatures and it led to increased temperatures and toxic chemicals in the atmosphere. What did this cause? It caused global warming because it depleted the ozone layer. This was an irreparable harm. That is a direct consequence of globalization. Because note, in the counterfactual, which was that there was no globalization, there would have been less industrialization. That meant that this irreparable harm that globalization has caused wouldn't have been there. Secondly, we think that because of the because countries like US wanted to become powerful, they needed to be able to co-opt smaller countries to join this agenda. That is why you find that most of the countries that trade with China are Africans. Why? Because Africans know that these are smaller countries that we can co-opt them into. US also does the same thing. Why is this very important? We think that platform that countries like this got to be able to sell their agenda in order to become powerful is something that has led to more inequalities. That's my second piece of argument. Note that the aggressive westernization of the global village meant that people were more likely to buy into who was the most powerful country. That is why when US says that, oh, let men and men marry, or let women and women to marry, it's because they are more powerful. And that is very difficult because it's a direct consequence of globalization. That's the second metric of that's more inequalities has been caused. Note that globalization, the whole intent was to have a society where we have more equity, people have more a platform to self-actualize and be able to access all these goods that globalization preach. But to the extent that globalization and status quo has caused more inequalities, where countries like Africa are continuously being deprived of the harms or fruits of globalization, and the West are those who continue to enjoy the fruits of globalization. We think that whole idea was a Western methodology to be able to conquer and control the world. Second piece, let's look at this. In the whole concept of especially they say that, the climate change, groups like COP and all of that are fighting to ensure that they control climate change. But let me tell you this, the reason why they are not succeeding is this, because of the globalization that is continuing to exist. Why is this true? Notice that because countries always want to dominate on the world stage, because of globalization, they are continuously producing more goods. They always want to compete each other. That means that if your court says that stop polluting the environment, the only way they can compete is by producing more, because they know that they have a larger market. So the whole consequence of globalization is inherent in this. We are not able to control climate change because countries like China feel like, I have to produce more, no matter what consequences are caused. I'm just going to pay $100 million, and then there will be smaller countries to come and tap into, like, through the Paris Agreement, to be able to fight global warming. We think that that is not very true, and we think that that cannot be the whole crack of this. Before I continue, I'll take you. Note, what caused that in the first place? That's the whole debate. We are telling you that because of the aggressive need for these people to be able to compete, especially in goods, that led to the industrialization. And that is what has caused global warming. So we are not saying that you are going to solve it using globalization. We are saying that it's globalization that has caused that problem in the first place. The third is global peace. Look, panel. Let's look at this. The reason why there cannot be a guaranteed global peace is because these countries are always continuously to compete. In that process, there's always going to be friction. That is very important, because the whole concept of peace is that people are able to live together regardless of their differences. But note, people are in competition. That means that they are likely to do things that are not in the interest of the other actors. That means that threat of peace is always going to, that threat of peace is not going to be existent in globalization, because China and US are always going to be fighting over who can control the world stage, and we think that that's the direct threat to peace. That's a direct consequence of globalization. Panel, for someone to win today's debate, you have to disprove why globalization has not caused an irreparable harm, and also prove why globalization has not caused more inequalities, and why globalization has not led to slippery slope. Note that globalization continues to exist, and all these harms I've told you continue to exist. That slippery slope is something that is there. We think that globalization has failed. Proud to propose.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, the member of government. I'd love to welcome the member of opposition to take the stage. Here.
Panel, we think globalization was a realization that there were countries which were existing in particular echo chambers, and they had particular challenges which they would solve by having more, a bigger platform to deal with. But also there was a realization that there are particular existential challenges to humanity and the entire world that needed to be combated only as a result of consensus. We tell you that largely the harms you get from side government that exist because, for example, things like global warming, etc., could still occur to human beings because they had incentives to develop and have more carbon emissions. The difference is on how you combat those challenges, that in their world there is no bigger consensus from everyone and like a corrective, robust approach on how to deal with them. We only deal with them only within your echo chambers and with limited tools. But let us show you why we win today's debate, right? So panel, we think how globalization manifested and the tools it used sort of to achieve its goal were things like through more creating platforms for socialization. Things like social media, that is to say that you have a robust world on one similar network interacting. Why is that important? Because people are able to access information. That is something that was said by our opening, but you don't show us why this information is important. We think that the global south we care about, or how people develop, is the capacity to access valuable information. We tell you in a world where there is no interaction, where there is no access to information, people are not able to form knowledge in which they use to form and make their daily decisions, or even their career choices, or even to be better individuals, or being more productive. We think that's what things like social media do. But you also tell you one of the problems we had was because of this existing in echo chambers, there was large decentralization of cultures and minimal interaction, and there was minimal hostility. What globalization has done through it, it feels like World Cup, is that people are able to come together and celebrate each other
other. And that kind of familiarity, what it does is that it narrows, like it reduces the hostility that happens between like two cultures, right? But why is that also important? Is that even when we are not able to synchronize like the Muslim world and the Christian world, etc., is that we're able to understand each other and like sort of value each other. But even when we don't, at least we get to have a conversation about it and how we can exist and evolve as a society. We think those things are important. But there are also things like tools of globalization, like UN, like global summits. What they do is that they create a structure in which people's challenges can be addressed, especially like the global south, right? Things like having a robust international legal system, it means that these injustices that are meted on like global south are able to be dealt with. We tell you when you have challenges within echo chambers, there is no one to help you. Like when Rwanda and Uganda attack Congo, like there is no solvency because there is no one like to vouch for Congo. But Congo can be able to use like the global legal structures like the ICC, etc., to get some sort of solvency and get reparations. We tell you from the world that does not have that kind of collective, robust way of dealing with things, like those things don't have like a way out of those things. And that's essential to do with things like coercion. The argument that these guys advance is that people like the powerful like coerce the weak and are able to dominate them. We think that essentially happens in the echo chamber because what happens in that world is that strong people like dictators are able to abuse human rights of citizens, and these people don't have a collective to help them. We think countries like the Soviet Union, Russia is able to oppress Ukraine without any kind of opt-out, right? What happens without of coercion is that strong and weak states are able to form alliances with along those particular consensuses that are brought about. That is to say that Ukraine on the verge of sovereignty and rights which are appreciated and exist in the global tools like UN, like legal structures are able to get some sort of solvency, some sort of help. In their world, Russia just kicks them and have no one to help them. We think that is very important. But also we think what globalization has done, especially in the political and human rights, we think that is something we value. In their world, Africa countries are able to deal with what they want, they can always oppress their people and there's nothing to do. But what globalization has done is to expand things like human rights. That is to say that for example, people in Uganda or in Kenya or whatever part of the world there is, are able to appreciate these global values of autonomy, of sovereignty, etc., which you don't get from their echo chambers, right? We think the exposure to these things, even when they are forced on us, like their source is the West, we think those are things human beings inherently value and they will choose on any day. We don't think these individuals are able to access those things in a world where you don't have a global force that is pushing for those things. But the strongest, also what you get from opening government, which was really substantive, was the idea of countries are becoming more taking isolationist policies. That is to say that they're moving out from the bigger global structure. Giving an example of Make America Great Again. We don't assume that globalization does not have opposition, but globalization has been able to succeed because it has been able to successfully push back against such things. And that is why people like Donald Trump cannot be revolted, because the global consensus is that those things are bad for us, and people push back and they're alienated from social structures like social media, all these form of platforms. In the world, you don't get that. But secondly, you have more countries like China, etc., that continue to come together through the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, that kind of form of gathering together. And we think they get more. They get more utility from that side. But also, what we want to talk about is that is the idea of sanctions, those challenges, economic challenges. We tell it might be true that challenges like 2008 crisis is there, but all these countries through globalization are able to come together through a robust consensus to be able to get out of those challenges, and that is what makes them strong. The difference from your side is that people are willing to deal with those challenges alone, and they don't have a lot of tools at their exposure. But because of this robust approach, that the world is able to raise together. Things like COVID-19, where African countries don't have capacity to help themselves, they get a lot of donations in terms of vaccines, which they would rather not get within their system. Look at how Africa is largely not innovative. They don't have any vaccine coming from themselves. They don't have anything. We think those are things that make globalization better. But now we are happy to tell you that the world is wealthier than it has ever been in history of humanity. That is to say that consensus global tools like MDGs, which push to make sure that we can access immunization, water, basic things like nutrition. Those are things you achieve through global consensus, and it's an incentive. You have donations, you have aid, which you would not get. The reason why Uganda is not involved is not because the echo chamber does not exist. It's because it does not, in and of itself, cannot sustain itself. So it needs that level of consensus. But also the world has existential challenges like climate change, and that's why you have
exploration, you have like the US and Russia leaving to explore other planets, things that we wouldn't manage to do on echo chamber. So these countries get like to survive on the power of others. In their world, people just want to develop themselves and don't care about another person. We tell you the world of theirs which existed before globalization was worse than before. We think the world is more peaceful today than it was during alliance and Axis powers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Member of Opposition. I'd love to welcome our last speaker on the government bench, the government whip. Here.
Okay. I hope I can be heard very clearly. So, my name is Jones. I'll be CG whip for today's debate. So, I start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, panel, notice that we are the only team, especially from CG, that gives you certain metrics like powerful countries have instigated this idea of globalization. How it looks like is that these countries continue to put smaller countries together in order to push their goals, such as trade and things like OO says, right? What it means is that it limits that innovative abilities of these small countries to be able to depend on their own resources, right? It means that in that bit, they are trying to trade with people, right? It means that then they get easier access to people when he says that, oh, people can just go to other countries to get the same goods. But then because of these things, countries cannot depend on their own resources. They depend on external sources for their things, right? What the impacts are that when people like the US and the Russia have a banter and a war like that, it then disrupts that supply chain to these countries. What it looks like is that countries like Ukraine that are heavily dependent on agricultural things, which they export to countries like Africa necessarily, are better at fault when Ukraine is at war with Russia, right? It means that the economy of these smaller countries necessarily rely on these global people like Russia and Ukraine, right? It means that these people cannot survive if any other things happen, right? But then again, we tell you that the harms that's caused in society is very, very important, right? To the extent that it is a threat to global peace is what we regret. How does this look like? We think that organizations like the UN and things were formed after the Second World War, right, to be able to sustain global peace. What happens in status quo is that all countries that belong to these organizations do not necessarily have the same voice, right? It means that when even all countries in Africa vote no that Russia should stop the war, Russia has no incentive because they have things like veto powers and things that continue to allow them to continue the war in Ukraine. It means that certain things like globalization have come together. It means that we have not been able to solve things like global peace and all those things, right? But then again, they also say that then, oh, okay, people are better able to interact with each other, right? But then what do we say? We say that globalization has led to things like cultural appropriation. How then does these things look like? It looks like these powerful countries selling ideas like LGBTQ, where you have people, as certain African countries, having conversations about accepting it or not, because countries like the US have accepted it, right? It means that these countries better have an incentive to be able to push their own agenda. What then the relation to CEO is that they are able to then expand things like LGBTQ in countries like the Arab world where they are hosting World Cup, right? It means that they are able to tell that, oh, well, once you are in the Arab world, you are curtailing human rights, whilst they are also promoting LGBTQ, right? What it looks like is that people are then go to World Cups and begin to tell things like, oh, these people are oppressing people because they do not accept LGBTQ. We think that these people sell an idea of what they think is morally right into other cultures where they do not respect those things. We think that form of human rights should not exist, right? But then again, they say, okay, sanctions as a result of globalization, right? But then we say it is because of these globalizations that has resulted in the heavy interdependence on these countries, right? It means that we already analyzed to you that countries like Ukraine that produce all these poultry feeds and soya things to countries like Africa, right? It means that we are not incentivized to innovate within ourselves to be able to produce these things. Once we depend on them through global trade and all these things, it means that when anything happens, we are just cut off like that, right? But then again, we say, even if that is the case, they say globalization has caused people to rather invest in Africa, right? It means that there is no level playing ground for all countries when it comes to globalization. What it means is that countries have not advanced together in the same vein. So they cannot work together when it comes to things like climate change, right? What it means, it then means is that they say, because of these things, we need to come together for climate change. But then these people then do not have an incentive to go for climate change because they have already pulled you together, and through trade, they're able to push their goods to you, right? It means that they rather prefer to pay fines and things for you, the developing country, who is rather suffering more from climate change, to be able to come and take those monies to go and spend, right? They do not have any incentive to solve those things because you are not heavily as industrialized as those people, right? But then again, to much more of our substantive case, which we bring to you, right? We say that then, to the extent where we think that there is an irreparable harm that has been caused, such as global peace, where global actors cannot act because powerful countries have that ability to veto everything even smaller countries vote for, we think that itself is not good, right? But then again, because of it's going to breed much more of inequalities, right? We already analyzed to you how even on these global organizations, people do not have equal voices, right? It means that the world continues to have this inequality between the developed world and the developing world. What it does is that the developing world do not really have a voice because even if they speak, they are heavily dependent on these people for things like drugs and things, right? It means that you do not have an incentive to be able to speak against them. It means that they are always able to push their culture on you, and we think that itself will result in things like inequalities and things. I'll take you for.
Okay, so since you say the purpose of globalization was for the powerful to have world market access, therefore, by your own metric, wouldn't you say globalization hasn't failed since it has achieved that purpose which you as CG has set?
But then we say that then, even in that purpose, it has failed because once they pushed on that global market, we already analyzed from our side that these industrializations have led to climate change because they brought us together in order to push their goods on us. That is what we analyzed to you, that in these phases, they have led to climate change. It means that if there was no form of globalization, these people would not have that ready market to be able to be heavily industrialized to cause climate change. They then do not have any incentive to continue to then solve the case of climate change, right? But then again, we tell you that, okay, the peace and security is very, very important because we think countries like Iran and things have been sidelined. It means that countries like the US continue to, let's say, have nuclear weapons, while they continue to curtail sovereign countries such as Iran and things from having nuclear weapons. It means that countries have that incentive to continue to grow individually because they have that leverage over you, right? It means that you cannot act on yourself. We also tell you that that culture of how they push things like LGBTQ through human rights, where CEO comes to analyze all those things, we think that itself is a method of them pushing their culture in you. We think then the excesses then happens, right? But then again, to the point where we think globalization has not been able to achieve global peace, we think it has failed. Never been proud to propose.
Thank you. The government whip. I'd love to welcome our last speaker, the opposition whip. Here.
Panel, what does a world without globalization look like? A world without globalization would look like where we had the Axis powers and the other powers existing, causing like Cold War politics, or causing things like protectionist policies existing, or isolationist policies existing. What does a world with now globalization look like? This is where we have things such as global consensus existing, where we have metrics where you can hold others accountable. But thirdly, this is where we have things such as World Cup, the UN, World Bank, bonding different people together, and we think that is a world where we do not have mutual destruction, but a world where we have survival of the world existing. But the reason why we think that CG is out of this debate, CG comes and tells you that we think things such as climate change have been heavily caused because of these people coming together to create market. But we tell you, in a world where you had no globalization, still you would have climate change existing because countries would be incentivized to still develop. But secondly, we think that they would still tap into the fourth industrial revolution to continuously develop. But what is the difference now here? The difference now here is these countries have an incentive to come together. They have that global collective collectiveness to come together to make sure they solve climate change. We think that even when African countries are the least developed, but most affected by climate change, we think that developed countries like the US have brought about the loss and damage finances to cater for African countries that exist in that particular paradigm. But in a world where you have isolationists, you have those chambers existing, we think that countries do not have access to that technology, but secondly, they do not have that capacity to make sure they solve such problems because Africa would still remain underdeveloped and they do not have anything to sustain themselves. But second reason why CG is out of this debate, they tell you that we will have more inequalities existing. We tell you that in a world where we have equality now because we all can access YouTube, we all can access this technology, we think that inequality exists more in a world where you would have no globalization. We do not say that globalization doesn't have failures, but we tell you that the achievements that exist in the world are more than the failures that exist. But then to OG, why is OG out of this debate? OG tells you that one, we think that there is coercion existing, but secondly, we think that these countries have failed to fulfill commitments. Now we tell you, at a point in time that we have a UN collectively existing, there is global consensus to make sure you hold the US accountable because you expect from them something. At a point in time that we do not have these bodies existing, notice that what happens in African countries where you have gross human rights abuse, but secondly, where you have like maybe this coercion existing, you do not have a way out. The reason why Ukraine can come out and talk, it's because there is a global consensus to hold the NATO or the UN bodies accountable for this. But in a world where that does not exist, each of the countries live on their own. There is that isolationist policy that is existing. Even when they are abused, even when the dictatorship is existing, there is no one to hold accountable in that world, and we think that countries, there is more inequality existing in such a world. But thirdly, we tell you that, for example, in the political world and how it has made it better, we tell you that in African countries where, in the global south, where people were grossly poor before like 2008, but then we are having MDGs, SDGs existing for these countries that have elevated them from poverty, then we think that is because of globalization, due to the access of technology, due to the access of information that does exist in that world. But thirdly, what you need to all to understand is that exploitation exists in both sides, but where it would better be solved. We think that leaders would continue to exploit their citizens and would continue to exploit these countries. But a point in time that these countries have where to collectively look for repatriations and look for anything because of diplomacy and international relations that exist, then we think that is a better world rather than being continuously exploited because of that trade. But then, I'll take later. But then on the issue of collective responsibility and how it has catered for these countries and the other less developed countries, right? At a point in time that African countries are suffering or they do not have any sustainability in means, we think that these countries, due to globalization, they have an incentive, they have a responsibility to provide donations, to provide foreign aid, to make sure that these countries sustain themselves. Any failure that we want to attribute to these countries would think would be attributed to the failure of policies maybe in African countries, but not necessarily to globalization that does exist in that particular paradigm. I'll take CG if you have any PR.
So we tell you that, the essence of globalization, which was to solve problems, is rather causing more problems, and your attempt to solve it is rather causing more problems. That's the slippery slope effect that we analyze.
Panel, you notice we tell you that climate change would still exist because countries would still independently develop due to technology advancement or due to making sure that they progress. There is nothing like telling us globalization has existed because we have anything existing. The development would still take place, but now it becomes, how would you best get climate action? That is why we have things like COP existing. That's why we have the Paris Agreement in place. That's why we have the national determined contributions to make sure that these countries take action. And if they do not take action, you have a body where you can sanction them because they have not taken action. You have where they can fulfill their commitments because they have not taken action. So we think in a world where you have better accountability, where you have better mechanisms to solve these problems, is a world which we prefer, right? So notice that what we tell you in this debate from CO, one, we tell you that we think that globalization has not entirely failed and it has achievements that outweigh the failures they want to point out in terms of diplomacy and international relations that have catered for these countries. But then another thing we tell you is at a point in time that you do not have things like World Cup existing or that existing, we think that there wouldn't be information like on social media. You wouldn't access information that is rather for development. I'll take your PR.
All right, so you say that the world without globalization would look like the Axis and central powers. From side OG, we tell you that these things exist when we have the Eastern Bloc passing the Western Bloc. But secondly, things like the World Cup and Olympics have always been there, even before World War II. So it's not new and exclusive to the
Well, Pano, that's why we tell you that even though they want to assume that World Cup has ever existed, we think that bodies, collective bodies like the World Bank, UN, have just existed because of the willingness to make sure we have all this right. But also another assertion they make is that Africa has not developed. We think that Africa's economic growth over the past several decades has been steady, although it has been differentiated across the different countries. But secondly, we think that globalization has brought about many opportunities to Africans and African economies that have transformed them to have the sustainable because of the global chain market, or because they're able to compete at a global market, and that has increased the GDP of these countries, right? But secondly, what we tell you, it has been able to make sure we have like a collective body or a collective responsibility as a world to make sure we solve our problems, as compared to when we would be independent and inequalities increase, for example, where you have like things like climate change, CG comes and tells you about, which are not catered for in that world. But secondly, we tell you that at a point in time that we have technology in terms of social media, we're able to access this technology, which makes us solve these problems better. But in their world, you have mutual destruction of the world because they are divided on different blocks. All these countries are having more protectionist policies and isolationist policies, which do not exist in that country. So one, we tell you that for the capacity of these countries to be increased, or for the injustices not to be there, we think that sanctions can only be catered for when you have a collective body you can hold accountable, or a country you can hold accountable. But secondly, we tell you that on a comparative where you do not have any diplomacy and international relations existing, then that's a world that you would have destruction. Never been proud to oppose.
Thank you. Thank you so much for debating. We love you guys to step in. It's also stepping out. Oh, you guys can go to lunch. Yeah, it's a silent round. So, yeah, as you hug each other, shake hands for the next rounds. All the best.